Well, welcome everyone to our board members. Thank you very much for taking the time to participate in this virtual session. This session is really focused on the budget, ensuring that we as board members have a good sense of where we are in the budget development process, understanding some of the challenges and opportunities we have. We all know and feel very strongly that this is a very important, if not the most important thing that we do. We have fiduciary responsibilities to the university, and it is our duty to make sure that we are looking after the finances of the university and ensuring that our budget is something that is reasonable and has been developed with great care and consideration for the impact that any changes to that budget will have on our families and students here at Radford. So today is an information day. We're really trying to ensure that the board is informed. What will happen in the future, the Business Affairs Committee will actually be making a formal recommendation at the next committee, provided most of the questions that we have are answered. They'll be making a recommendation for us to consider any changes to the budget or accepting the budget as it's proposed. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to the president. But thank you again for being here, and for any participants that are non-board members, thank you very much for taking the time. It's a very important meeting.
Thank you, Rector McMahon. And like the rector said, I appreciate everybody taking this extra time out of your schedules to be here with us. And the recommendation for this meeting, just as a reminder, it came from the governor. When the Council of Presidents were meeting with the governor, he said one of the biggest pieces of feedback that he receives every year is not enough information around tuition from all the universities. So this was kind of a suggestion of a way that we could introduce the topic, more information around it, and importantly, give space for questions. So that way, if there are additional questions, we've got time to source that information and provide it, again, by the time of the next meeting or during the next meeting, so you all feel like you are fully informed in the decisions you're making. This is a change in process from last year in timing. So like everything, and I'm a scientist, this is an experiment. Okay, we try this, we believe this will be a better iteration, and we take that feedback, and again, we try to continue the process each year. And just to keep in mind, at Radford, we're committed to two things. We're committed to a high quality, highly engaged student experience, and we're also committed to affordability. Those things are both very important here. They don't necessarily play nicely together, but we are going to continue to do our best to limit the cost of increases that get passed on to students. And again, welcome and thank you for being here.
So Tyler, did you want to give us an introduction to this workshop as well, specifically? You're muted.
There we go. And I'll just echo some of what has been said already. The purpose really is to improve and strengthen our budget and tuition fee development process over what we did last year. And I think, this opportunity really is to receive some information and have a discussion, ask questions, and feel like that we as a board are in a good place to move forward. And as the rector mentioned, have a recommendation come from the Business Affairs and Audit Committee to the full board at our March meeting. So obviously after today, I imagine there will probably be lots of one-on-one conversations and follow-up just to make sure, again, that everyone has everything that they need and that the committee is in a good place to move forward and come to the March meeting ready to make a recommendation. So that's really the intent. No votes today, as Deb mentioned, it's just informational. So really appreciate Dr. Hoover, the president, also Deb and Marquette, and the rest of the committee for their patience and willingness to sort of indulge and experiment, as the president mentioned, so that we can try to get a good process in place for our budget and for tuition and fees, so that we are doubling down on our commitment to affordability and making sure that we're moving the institution in the right direction.
So I'll turn it over to our VP, Rob Hubert.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the time to be here and for us to have this discussion. We're sharing information really for discussion and ultimately preparation for the March BOD meeting, which has already been shared. And so just as a reminder, we are not taking any action items at this meeting, and no decisions will be made. We will talk about some of the logistical technical things first that we will be bringing to the March meeting. And then the bulk of today's meeting will be to discuss the budget preparation that we're going through now and possible thoughts around tuition and tuition pricing. So really appreciate the time. Just as an update for our routine action items of the committee, the fall is when we focus on the approval of the university operating budget, and when in the years that it's required every other year, the 6-year plans, not only the financial plan, but the plan submissions to the state. And then in spring, summer, which is this March meeting coming up, we certify that we are in compliance with our debt management policy. And then as we've already discussed, bring a recommendation for an approval of tuition and fee rates for the upcoming academic year. As we've discussed earlier in earlier meetings, this is a little ahead of what we have traditionally done. And the main driver for that is to have information out to our students as soon as possible so that it can help them as they're making decisions leading up to the May 1st deadline. In any normal year, May 1st would be the target. This year, many of you have probably heard a lot of the complications with the rollout of the new FAFSA, et cetera, thinking that might extend the May 1st deadline if necessary. But regardless, we think this March target for tuition setting is appropriate. And then as needed, we would bring operating budget adjustments to the board, and we'll discuss what some of those are leading into this next fiscal year. So just quickly, I will actually introduce our debt management compliance that we'll bring in March. And the fact is that we have a debt management policy. We try to focus on long-term strategic uses of debt and only when necessary or when there's an advantage to the university. We analyze this annually. And just to give the board an idea of the composition of our debt, we really have 3 buckets, and that consists of a student fitness center, residence halls, and then the campus expansion project, which is primarily around student residences as well. But these are the primary drivers of our debt. We currently are at a debt ratio of 2.34%. The goal is to remain under 7%. And there are a few exceptions of where university state institutions are allowed to exceed the 7%. We've not come close to that. We are anticipating that in 2024, our debt burden ratio will trend upward to 2.91%. The primary driver of that is just a lower total operating number. Basically, the denominator is going to be lower in future years. We currently have approximately $50 million in principal left remaining to pay. Principal and interest is around $58 million. So we watch this closely, but these are all in support of student activity, student health, and student residence halls. I will stop there to take questions, but that's pretty straightforward. Any questions? Great.
And if I could add, we can't see your hands if you're raising them.
Yes.
So if you do have questions, please go turn on your mic and say, I've got a question.
Up.
Yeah, speak up.
Thank you. So going into the budget overview, President Danilovich hit on a couple of these already. We have a 2-year plan in place. And as we look at resourcing the university, our primary driver, of course, is to fund the normal operations of the university and continue funding new initiatives that fall within that 2-year plan, within those goals. And so at a high level, our primary goals are to support quality academic programs and exceptional student support while maintaining affordability. So that goes into all of the decisions that we make when we're developing the budget. We also, at the same time, want to recruit and retain a strong, high-quality faculty and staff. And the reason is because that aligns perfectly with the first goal of supporting quality academic programs. So that is also in the equation. During this past year, much of the work that we introduced early last year in the fiscal year has been focused around streamlining budget processes and enabling effective local decisions within units. And we've done this both through improving processes and people. And I hope that you will see some of that work coming to bear as we present today, because we've made improvements there. We have a lot more transparency, and we believe we have a clearer budget and budget process. And then fourth, and related to conversations we've had leading up to this fiscal year as well, we are looking at areas where right sizing is necessary. And right sizing in a positive way, meaning we're making adjustments, realignments, we're making the best use of our resources as we make decisions, looking at things that we might be able to set aside. They're no longer as relevant. We're picking up things that are really relevant and important and support those goals that I just talked about. So as we move through the numbers, we'll talk more about that. In terms of remaining an affordable institution, just have a few slides that give you a comparison of where we are as compared to other four-year public institutions. Some of you have seen this slide before, now updated to reflect 2024. And if you look on this trend line, the blue trend line demonstrates the average cost of institutions in the state according to Chev's numbers. And then the red line is where Radford University trends. You can see we remain one of the most affordable institutions in the state. And in the graphic on the right-hand side, you can see our rank among all those institutions. And we are 12th or the fourth most affordable in the state. If you look at where the majority of our students go, if they they are admitted to Radford and then choose another in-state institution, this graphic demonstrates those approximately 1,700 students of the highest population that go elsewhere. So this is the head count, with JMU obviously running in first place, Old Dominion, George Mason, and then the others following. And then using those institutions as a comparison, you can see how we compare with in-state tuition to each of those institutions. And we run each year and have historically been more affordable than each of those in total cost, tuition, fees, room and board. Then at the same time, we took some comparisons for out-of-state competitors as well. And you can see the list here includes Appalachian State, UNC Charlotte, East Tennessee, UNC Greensboro, East Carolina, and West Virginia. And you can see as a comparison out of state to out of state, how we rank there. East Tennessee and UNC Greensboro, obviously more competitive at out of state rates. So what does that tell us basically is that we remain affordable. We want to continue that as we look to build quality programs. And then that leads us to the current budget summary and where we are in terms of our operating budget at this time. This is the original budget that was approved in September, representing E&G revenue and expenses of almost 160 million, student financial aid at 26 million, sponsored programs at 9 million, and the auxiliary enterprise at 63 million. Again, this was what was presented. Just as a reminder, we were projecting almost $1 million deficit in the auxiliaries, 999,000, and we're anticipating to use a reserve draw to close that gap if needed. And we're still tracking that, which we'll talk about in a little bit about where the auxiliaries are and what the actual enrollment and comp fees calculated to be at this point. As we look at mid-year adjustments that we might bring to the board, either technical or informational from the government or state appropriations, we've we use these three buckets. Really concerns the general fund. These are mid-year financial aid allocations, central appropriations, which we do have some to talk through. We monitor the business levels, mainly around enrollment, as tuition is our primary source of revenue. And then miscellaneous, which this list grew during COVID, primarily related to relief funds and relief grant opportunities that come to the university. So related to the general fund, the categories include central appropriation adjustments, student financial aid increases, and sponsored project funding. Along the lines of central appropriation adjustments, I won't go through each of these that are listed as examples, but I will hit a few highlights. In terms of affordable access, we received mid-year a $530,000 allocation to address the nursing shortage. And that $530,000 was actually identified to go towards nursing faculty, to improve and grow nursing faculty. So actually what we have done is increase salaries for our nursing faculty in a very formulaic fashion that I think actually makes sense and is about as fair a process as possible. And not to get into the weeds too much, but as an example, because we'll be talking about a similar compensation study across the university, we looked at all nursing faculty who were not at the midpoint and adjusted those that were not at midpoint yet. We adjusted their salaries up. And then for each of those faculty members who were in their position for a length of time over a year, we also calculated a 1% salary increase for each year in that particular position. And if the faculty member was not making that or more, we also bumped that faculty member's salary up and then awarded 5% on top of that across the board. So this is really critical for us to maintain competitiveness in our nursing fields. We know nurse faculty compete with the external market in hospitals, but as an example, this affordable access funding, I believe, went a long way to help us continue to be competitive in the nursing workforce as we're hiring and recruiting the top nurse faculty. Another appropriation that came through affordable access was a $2.9 million discretionary allocation that went towards operating, and that came through mid-year as well. Student financial assistance, again, I won't go into each of these examples, but we did receive affordable access appropriation to the tune of $4.6 million. That was in addition to the $26 million that we indicated in the original budget. So that would be an adjustment as well. And then we have sponsored project funding that are for some really cool projects. They're smaller dollar amounts, but the Collegiate Recovery Program allows us to expand the Radford Recovery Program and offer more services. And the Education Teacher Support Grant is in support of teachers who are required to receive additional coursework in areas required for a special education endorsement. So again, cool projects. Those are fairly small dollar amounts that we'll adjust and watch as we move forward, but don't require board approval. As we think about our business levels, as I mentioned, fall spring enrollment is critical to us because tuition is such a big portion of our revenue budget. We actually went into 2024 with a higher headcount than anticipated. We had this conversation in September that we anticipated a decline going into FY24, and the decline was actually less than what we anticipated or projected. We still had a decline from the previous year, but it was smaller than projected. And that's what these numbers reflect, total headcount. We also have talked a number of times about the importance of the composition of our student enrollment. And this graph, I think, represents the differences and why that is important. So our headcount was higher. Our tuition dollars that came in the door compared to budget are right on target, just below the budgeted amount. But if you look at comprehensive fee and other auxiliaries, the amounts are lower than what we projected. And the reason is because as the composition shifts and our students might be taking online programs, non-residential, fast track programs, et cetera. That impacts the revenue that comes in the door via comprehensive fee and auxiliary dining room and board, for example. So that is something that we pay close attention to. We have to monitor, and it's not enough to just say we're doing well in total headcount. We have to be really cognizant and careful as we look at the projections for comp fees and the auxiliaries so that they can support themselves. There were a number of miscellaneous relief funds that continue. These are primarily still the continuation of COVID-related funding and related to financial aid. And so you'll see in the summary of adjustments where we actually have identified the dollar amounts. But just as an example of the scale for some of these, the American Rescue Plan or ARPA funds were $5.5 million. The Governor's Emergency Educational Relief Fund, or GERF, was at $608,000, again, going towards student financial assistance. So then the budget summary with those adjustments, just to draw your attention to two lines specifically, the E&G education in general adjustment coming from those state appropriations and the affordable access grants, $3.3 million increase. And then student financial assistance, which is fantastic that we're able to direct that aid directly to students in the range of $12.1 million. Then if we look at the 23-24 operating budget to date, this is actuals through January 31st. We present this slide just to give you an idea of where we stand currently. But to be very fair, this is not really too meaningful because of the timing. We're not like a monthly cycle. If we were manufacturing some kind of technology, for example, or sales, we're month to month to month. This really relates more to timing of when tuition payments come in the door and expenses go out the door. But we do show our actuals through January 31st. I will say that we do not expect to have any we don't have concerns about not being able to meet our targets or being able to have correlating decreases on the expense side if revenues are below what we have anticipated. So any questions? I think this might be a good time to stop and ask for questions before we go into the 25.
Are there any questions from the board?
Hi, this is George. I do have a couple of questions. On the headcount that you talked about, the 7531, how does that split relative to RUC and the RU main campus? Because obviously the comprehensive fee collections are right now lower than budgeted. I'm assuming quite a bit of that is because you don't have as many people at the RU main campus. Is that a fair statement? And what is the breakdown?
Yeah, do you know that head count right off?
I'm trying to look it up right now. George, one of I should be able to articulate it off the top of my head. The transition we're going through right now, there's a lot of online programs at the RUC campus. And traditionally, we have counted those as RUC students. We are in the process of shifting because an online student at RUC is an online student. They're not RUC. So we're actually recounting our numbers. And so I apologize. I've got both those numbers floating around in my head. Our RUC students really are our in-person RUC students. The same with main campus, and all of our online students we're consolidating together because the online students don't pay the same rate of fee. So we're in the process of getting this organized right now. And I think we've got I think by this fall-ish, we'll at least have a plan. It may take another year to actually get the fees sorted out on that.
Yeah, George, I apologize. I don't have that breakdown. It's less than 1,000 in RUC,
yeah,
and even fewer if you take Brett's calculations and run out the online student numbers.
Okay, well, I appreciate that.
We'll report that exact number to you.
One of the reasons why I'm asking is last year when we passed the budget, and this year there seems to be uh, a disconnect between our forecasted comprehensive fee collections versus tuition. So I think we made an adjustment right when you came on, Rob, because we had, I think it was we did the same thing where we over budgeted comprehensive fee, and it was just because of the mix in the enrollment at the end of the day. So it sounds like we have a path to better forecast that revenue and align the two. Just because an 8% difference between what was projected versus what's actually coming in. Fortunately, what you said there, Rob, was that there's going to be a sufficient amount of expenses that will likely offset the decline in revenue. But that's still, from a forecasting perspective, that's a significant variance. So that's why I appreciate the diligence that are being done now to try to enhance that forecasting.
And George, I just looked it up. As we code right now, there are 876 students at RUC between undergrad and grad, but we know that there's a confounding between some online students that should be coded as online. But anyway, that's how we reported as of this fall semester, but we've still got some cleanup to do. Okay.
And George, you make a really good point when I'm going to talk a little bit about our tuition and fee structure realignment that we just mentioned we'll have to phase that in, of course. But to the online example, we have some programs labeled online. They're paying an online comp fee, but actually there is some in-person component and vice versa. So some of that is going on as well. And we do plan, we are working on that to make sure that those are aligned correctly and we are charging the correct comp fee.
And just an ask for for when you look at the budget, I don't know if it's an opportunity that can be done in time, but we had talked about what does affordability mean, and Chev, prepares that slide that it's, we look at affordability compared to schools within public schools within the Commonwealth. One of the things that I had mentioned was the expected family contribution that comes out of FAFSA. So if we consider what I call our addressable market, the 3.4 students, the ones that tend to qualify for Pell Grants, it'd be helpful if there's some metric out there or data to understand what is the expected family contribution for the targeted students that we have, just so that as we look at increasing tuition, right, is the expected family contribution declining while our position to increase tuition is going the other way. Ideally, you'd like them to go in the same path. The expected family contribution can offset the impact of tuition, but this day and age, it's hard to understand. And I recognize the new FAFSA form might prevent that data point, but it would be helpful, from my perspective, that's what I consider affordable. And since we know the demographic of the students we're going after, it would be, it's a lot easier to look at affordability from our market versus affordability across the whole Commonwealth.
Yeah, and George, I do want to respond to that a bit, because with the new FAFSA, expected family contribution goes away entirely. It's student aid index, and student aid index is not expected family contribution. It is just a scalar used for financial aid. So it just, that type of data point isn't available, but the example that I want to provide is affordability means different things to different people. And with the Radford tuition promise, we've been going out to high schools and community colleges, and it doesn't matter if a student is commuting to campus, in which case they only have to work a part-time job in the summer, and they can get a 4-year degree from Radford without loans, without any money from their parents, with no debt. And if they work full-time, or not full-time, but if they work part-time, so 15 hours a week during the semester, 30 hours a week over the summer, and they keep their grade point average at a 2.0 or better, they can live residentially on campus, kind of go full freight. These are the students that qualify for the Radford tuition promise. And again, no loans, no money from the parents, and they can graduate debt-free. Now, students may not be willing to put in that amount of work, and I understand that, but to me, that's affordable. And so the definitions may be different that are out there, and it's so we might have to go back and forth to see the specific type of data that you'd be interested in, because I mean, I really think that including student part-time work is part of this, is part of the solution. It does not have to be on loans, but that isn't something that we can do in our financial aid calculations. You know, we're not permitted when we calculate student financial aid to say this is what that is. But in my head, that's important. But federally, we're not supposed to do it that way. So it would be helpful to know kind of definitively what that is. So we've got the same data that we're considering.
I appreciate it. Thanks for the clarity on the new FAFSA. But exactly as you went through, Mr. President, that process of what affordability is, that would be helpful from my standpoint in terms of, as we make that increase, what does that do to a person's income? I think what you just articulated there really gets to the heart of it. So whatever the measure is, explaining the impact, I think is helpful from that standpoint. Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Yes, Deb, I have a quick question for Dr. Hoover. Referencing slides 22 and 23, you talked about the adjustments to the current year budget and the comparison between budget to actuals. And I think you touched on this briefly, Dr. Hoover, but can you, if you do have, can you talk a little bit about where you think the university will land or end at year end as relates to the budget?
Sure. I'm anticipating that we may be slightly below our projections in both revenue and expenses, but I do not anticipate we will have issues balancing the budget. If that's, I don't know if that's specific enough, but that's what with all the trends we're seeing now in our monthly close, that's what we're anticipating.
Thank you.
Any further questions? We can always get back to this, but let's move on.
Okay, great. So looking into the budget for 25, and again, we aren't making decisions on the budget. In fact, in March, we don't even approve the FY25 budget. We're looking at parameters and our understanding of what we know now and how that might lead into our decisions around tuition, knowing that the budget will still be a work in progress in March. But the buckets that we really take into consideration looking forward to FY25 include the economic outlook, mandatory cost increases, upcoming legislative actions, and enrollment outlook as well. So the economic outlook, we really rely heavily on the state's reports, and the governor's recently reported out that our total general fund revenues grew by 2% last month. They continue to have return each month higher than expected revenues, but there does seem to be a lot of caution out there, and they're recommending caution as well to institutions. And so we'll continue to monitor that. We do know inflation continues to subside as well, but again, not as much as what perception would like it to be subsiding. So we take those things into consideration. Then we look at our legislative actions that are now, as Tyler is in the middle of this, we're actively working through. And I just want to go, I know this is a lot to read, but this is a summary of the actions that we believe may have an impact on us, depending on which are adopted in the final budget. If you look in the executive budget proposal column, in the original budget proposed in December, there was 2.9 million in FY25 in affordable access allocated to Radford. And then a few rows down for salary increases, they were anticipating a 1% or recommending a 1% salary increase in FY25. And then on the next line, a 1% bonus in FY24. And then if you track all the way down in that column, they had some money that would go towards facilities, $4.5 million in maintenance reserve, and an $8 million allocation for deferred maintenance. Then in the middle column, the House amendments, $2.9 million was also in their budget proposal, and then an additional $3.5 million in each of the next 2 years of the biennium for FY25 and FY26. Their recommendation for salary increases was 3% in both 25 and 26. including a recommendation to move to minimum wage over the biennium with $13.50 an hour in FY25 and $15 an hour in FY26. Just real briefly, we've done some analysis on that. We have already made the move to $15 an hour for our full-time employees. This would primarily only impact us in student wage, and that impact is fairly minimal of $150,000 to $200,000. And then if you track down as well in the House amendments, they propose a $2.2 million allocation for maintenance reserves and $8 million in deferred maintenance. And then the Senate proposal included the 2.9 in affordable access, and then a much lower amount in any additional funds, $480,000 in FY25 and $700 in FY26. An additional $1.9 million in undergraduate financial aid and $115,000 in graduate student financial aid. Their recommendation for salary increases is 2.5% increase in each of the next 2 years. The same recommendation for increasing the minimum wage, and then no deferred maintenance in that $8 million outlay that was recommended in the original proposal. So this gives you an idea of where we are with what we might think is probable or not, and the considerations we have going into building the budget. One thing I will say about the $2.9 million in affordable access through the executive budget was that it was also accompanied with language that would require institutions to limit tuition increases to 2.5%. I think this is meaningful for a couple of reasons. One, it's obviously something we would pay attention to, but two, it gives us guidelines of what the governor is thinking in terms of acceptable range for tuition increases. So we took that into consideration as we built out our proposed budgets that we'll see in just a minute. The other factors include mandatory cost increases. I've listed them here. A lot of them are contractual items that we cannot do anything about at this time. Might be able to get out of some contracts as we look at saving strategies. We certainly review that, but a lot of these are continuing fixed costs such as escalating utilities, et cetera. So those are just things that we try to budget for. Roughly speaking, overall, that's about a 5% increase year over year. We're looking at items that are somewhat concerning only because they're trending higher than that typical 5% year over year, but we will point those out as needed. And then enrollment projections, we've already talked somewhat about this, but we don't just look at our enrollment projections that we submit to the state, which is referred to as our 2B enrollment report that we submit with our 6-year plans. But we also consider the mix, the composition of our students, the in-state versus out-of-state, online versus in-person, et cetera. All of those are factors in our planning. And as we see shifts, we accommodate those in our multi-year planning. This is one of the items I wanted to iterate for this year. We are not only looking at some of the rates that we might propose increases to, but also we are planning to realign in several areas. This is primarily driven by the fact that right now we have a tuition and fee rate schedule that's 22 pages long. And that can be pretty complicated for students, as you can imagine. So guiding principle number one is to provide a pricing structure that's clear and understandable for all students. It makes it easier for a student to say, yes, this is my program and this is what I would pay. And so in order to do that, these are 4 of the big areas that I think we have improvement to make, and that's aligning tuition and fees for students on main campus and in our Roanoke locations. We want to align grad programs where similarities exist. Some of these programs are differentiated in tuition rates by literally a few dollars, but the program is a different discipline, but very similar in the way that it's offered. So I think we have opportunity there. We want to align graduate fast track tuition and fees and offer the same in-state and out-of-state tuition for programs that are identified as 100% online. So we will, as we bring tuition and fee recommendations in March, some of that may be included. This becomes difficult, as you can imagine, because we have multi-year programs, and if there are wide variations as we look to roll out, for example, a program that's not charging an in-state tuition, an out-of-state tuition, currently they're in person, that differential could increase, and we want to be sure that we have safeguards for students so that they're not impacted negatively in the way that we roll this out. So leading with all of that as the background, the legislative information that we know at this point, the actions that may be coming down, the considerations around the impact of enrollment, et cetera. We did our modeling with multiple scenarios that we've labeled them growth, balanced, and contraction. The growth being a 2% tuition increase with an optimistic view, more optimistic than our previously submitted enrollment projections of flat enrollment, stabilized enrollment. The balanced scenario will represent a 1.5% tuition increase with a 3% enrollment decline that correlates with our projections that we submitted to the state. And then a contraction scenario of flat tuition, no tuition increase, and a 6% enrollment decline. So the next slide just shows the budget impact of each of those scenarios. So in the middle column, you have the balance scenario with the enrollment level tracking against the 2B enrollment projections of 3% decrease in enrollment and a 1.5% tuition increase. You can see the adjusted state revenue would be just over $157 million. And if we take in the expense categories below that revenue line, the base expense budget, along with some of the expected increases, mandatory costs that we mentioned, both state and Radford funded, along with strategic commitments that we have ongoing and have been funded through in previously one-time funds. For example, the Impact Lab and esports. These are important continuing programs, but have previously been funded through one-time funds. We've included them in our base budgets. In the budget building process, we ask from each division to look at divisional saving strategies to equal 3%. And so the divisional saving strategies line represents that number. And then above that line, we ask for at most 1% new operating requests. So a net of 2% saving strategies. And that 1% operating request is in the amount of $1 million reflected there. And so then to balance the budget, we use contingency and salary variance, which have traditionally been tools used, deployed by the university. We don't see any issues there to balance the budget. Without that, obviously our revenue target and expenses would not align. And so in the balanced model, you see we balance just slightly over zero balanced budget. If you look to the left of the balance model, you see the semi-growth model, which shows a 2% increase and a slight increase in the bottom line, the adjusted net. If you go to the far left in the growth column, that's 0% enrollment, meaning flat enrollment, stabilized enrollment, and a 2% tuition and fee increase and a $2 million surplus. The reason I point this out is because this, I think, shows really well the impact of enrollment is more meaningful to us than the impact of a 0.5% tuition increase. And that's really meaningful as we focus our strategies on stabilizing enrollment. If you look to the right of the balance scenario, you have semi-contraction, 0% tuition and fee increase, and the consistent 3% decline in enrollment, and contraction projects an even greater enrollment decline than what we projected in our projections from last year. The dollar amount in that semi-contraction example is $777,000 deficit. So if we continue along those lines, some of the items that we might use to adjust that will be on in one of the slides coming up, but that's the dollar amount that I think we really consider that's meaningful. And then we compare that to the impact to each student of a 1.5% increase and a 2% tuition increase. And for in-state undergraduate students, that's a dollar change of $126 for their annual tuition and fee rate. At 2%, it's $168. Just looking at the impact of tuition increases, percentage increase, just as information, if we don't change anything about enrollment, each increment of 1% equals approximately $430,000. And that's what these graphs here represent. So then if we go back to the legislative actions and what we know now, what potentially could happen in our scenario modeling, which those scenarios are just, we threw those out there as examples. We think they're well informed and give good direction, but they are just scenarios. But in taking what we know based on what's been proposed in the legislative actions, one possible adjustment to those scenarios could play out where we have an operational impact of a 0% tuition increase and required to allocate a 3% salary increase across the board. And if you look at the Senate budget proposals, perhaps very little affordable access money. So what we look at this as not really worst case, but as something that could happen with a 0% tuition increase. We would have to look really closely at programs, initiatives that we would be forced to cut. So two of those would include a faculty and staff salary compensation study implementation, where we have allocated $1.5 million currently. We anticipate the cost will actually be more than that. We have ways of possibly looking for funding, but if we don't receive affordable access, additional operating support through affordable access, that could be a big loss. That would hurt us as we try to retain competitive faculty and staff, offer high quality programs, hiring new staff, retaining those that are here due to decreased job satisfaction. So we think that's a critical decision that we could be forced to make. The other is a decline in student programming and student experience. We mentioned that that's such a high priority. We requested $1 million from the state in our 6-year plan submission that was not funded in any of the budget proposals. Those included well-being internships, student engagement, peer mentoring programs, and the solidifying of the first Gen Center into our base operating. Those are critical initiatives geared towards students, and those would be those would have to be phased, delayed, or eliminated. So then just real quickly, we don't have, again, we're not making recommendations, but I do want to talk about current room rate structure and current dining rates. You all may remember we restructured, realigned our current room rates to make them simpler, easier to understand. That seems to have been a success according to student feedback. We are looking at a possible increase in those rates of 3 to 7% this year, and that's primarily driven due to the fact that auxiliaries have to be self-sustaining. And in order to do that, we've seen room and board rates across the state increase. There's been a lot of concern, even at a recent meeting of the Council of Presidents, concern expressed by several universities that they're seeing requests from vendors in dining rates and room rates of 5 to 9%. We're hoping to keep our increases below 7% in both. So I also showed the current board rates. Those were also realigned last year. And we are currently in active conversations with our dining provider. But we know that not only in the state, across the country, many external dining providers are asking for increases of, again, 5 to 9% there as well. Those are primarily driven by the cost of labor and food costs, and that's what they demonstrate in their proposals to us. But we will have a precise recommendation for the board when we come to those in March. And so then lastly, I just wanted to address comp fee and potential changes there. This shows, again, the incremental changes of a potential comp fee increase of 0 to 4.5%. we're looking into the budget detail currently. To George's point, we want to be sure we're as accurate as possible on these comp fee, and we want to be sure that the array of those comp fees, meaning the units that they are allocated to, are accurate as well and support the student initiatives that are related to each of those. So we'll be coming in March with a recommendation for comp fee change. Currently, we're looking at 0 to 4.5%, depending on how those budgets, those actuals shake out in the next month or so. And I believe that's the last informational slide. So we can open up for questions, discussion, and conversation. And I believe Tyler wanted to share a few things at the end of my comments as well.
Tyler, would you like to, is Tyler still with us?
Oh, he may have.
Oh,
Thank
there we
you.
are.
Hi, thank you so much, Rob. Appreciate the presentation. I think that's a lot of helpful information. Hopefully everyone on the board agrees and puts us on a good pathway as we look forward to making a recommendation and coming to a consensus at our March meeting. I'll reserve my comments until the end in case anyone has any pressing questions that they would like to ask and may need to reference back in the slide deck.
I have a question. This is Jimmy. What's the current occupancy rate of, I guess, the residence halls and the university apartments? How many of those are occupied now as opposed to being unoccupied?
It varies obviously between each unit, but we're roughly floating about 85, 87% occupancy. And we are planning to, that is taking into consideration bringing Muse offline and reallocating residence hall facilities.
Man, I'm surprised it's that high because, again, I live here in Radford and I don't see the students around campus walking, across Tyler. I'm shocked that it's that high, but I mean, I think it's great that we can occupy that many.
Yeah. Now, Jimmy, I will say one thing. I guess I would say it this way. We have been accommodating requests for single use apartments, et cetera, due to COVID and rebounding from COVID, probably at a higher rate than we would normally if we had a larger population. So some of that's hidden in that 85%, but that's not, I don't think it would change it that much, but that's where we could gain some efficiency and capacity if we need to grow.
Okay, thank you.
So just to
I
clarify.
have a question.
So that clarification means that we have 85%, approximately 85% occupancy, but in some cases, a single may be in an apartment that can accommodate 3 people.
Right.
So I just
And I
want to
don't
make
think,
sure
yeah,
that was
I don't think
clear.
that's extensive, but it is something that we, as we take Muse off, consider taking Muse offline, we are looking at total capacity where we would be forcing that.
And yeah, and so Jimmy, that might be like more to your question about if we have 100% occupancy means that in our apartments and other housing opportunities, they are all fully used. Like what is that
Each bed.
percentage? So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Thank you.
Because your point is really well taken.
I have a question. This is Lisa. How does the free tuition promise impact the scenarios where we're increasing or not increasing tuition? That's got to impact the overall numbers. What are we expecting the uptake in terms of our student taking advantage of that program?
So it could come in 2 different ways. One is just the dollar amount with current enrollment. We could accommodate the increase in tuition through our current scholarship funding. The unknown is the increased enrollment that might occur from that. If we continue to monitor that, we're seeing positive trends in enrollment. We're not seeing anything from my perspective that concerns me on the financial aid side and whether we would be able to sustain that. But we really won't know that impact until we have actual census or at least deposits and then census and be able to run exactly what that impact is. But I'm not seeing trends right now, Lisa, that concern me. I'm seeing optimistic trends that give me actually a really positive outlook for enrollment. But that to me would be the biggest driver or change in our model.
And Lisa, if I could add to that, here's the unknown is with the tuition promise, part of it was raising attention about Radford University, right? So currently it's almost 50% of our Virginia undergrads that qualify. And for a new class coming in, I mean, there are some positive signs coming in, and we've got this projected where we could increase our freshmen coming in to the Radford tuition promise by about 300, and we would still be good with the way we've got our aid dispersed.
Okay.
Now, let's say we increase 300 and 150 of those students are above 100,000 and only 150 are below, then we've still got even more capacity. And that's, counting those students going, let's say we increase 300 students this year, that those scale forward, right? You're retaining, those, 280 of those students the next year, et cetera. So we can accommodate that. But we don't know, again, with the Radford tuition promise, it could be that all potential growth, every single one of those students qualifies. We just don't know. So in some ways it's an experiment, but it's fairly robust to this first year. And we've got promising signs both in transfer enrollment and new freshmen right now. But Danette is not concerned that we're going to be, over the top, bringing in just a whole gaggle of new students that would throw us past that. So we've got an experiment, but we feel comfortably constrained that we're not going to be exceeding what we can support.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Other questions?
So I don't have a question, but I will say, Rob, well done in terms of pulling this information together. Very informational. I was going to ask a question around in terms of there's a lot of emphasis towards enrollment without trending detail in enrollment. And I know the intent is not to go into the deep conversation, but for future conversations, if you can give us a little bit more guidance on, we're optimistic with regards to it being flat year over year and going that way, going into subsequent quarters, or if it's going to improve and the impact that could have. I would appreciate that. But it's not an ask or a task for you to do. But the overall message here is well done with regards to this presentation.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that.
Are there other questions?
This is George. I do have a few questions. I did want to tack on to what Jimmy was asking and ask that, particularly with apartments, since the Muse coming offline next year is going to increase the need for residence hall capacity. Have we explored options of taking some of these apartments offline and what the expected cost savings would be if they were not online, recognizing there's some fixed costs that you're just going to have to sustain? Because while I think, responding to the student's desire for, having a single apartment is helpful, I'm sure that the cost of the room cost for it may not be completely offsetting that facility's operating costs just because there's a single person. So has that been explored as taking some of those sites offline to
Yeah, we actually have looked into that, George. I think the Muse brings a different perspective into the equation. Currently, with the way that we're trending, our residence life folks think we have the capacity to fit what we have projected as enrollment. They're at the tipping point, though, of whether some of the, for example, upperclassmen, seniors would actually have space in on-campus apartments or not if with Muse offline. So we're looking into that, but right now of the university-owned properties with Muse coming offline, it looks like we will need every one of those. But we are iterating through that currently.
Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, the other thought process has been the city of Radford having some of the lost revenue, tax revenue that comes from the local landlords that, when they have vacancies, they're not getting the revenue streams that then flows back to the city. So, reducing our footprint on apartments would certainly expand the tax base or at least support the city where its needs are. In the legislative slide, there was a deferred maintenance of $8 million that the House and the governor had submitted. Is it correct to say that that's one-time money that would go towards E&G funded facilities where we have deferred maintenance in the past? Is that how you
Correct.
read that?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And then this is a different question, but what is needed to, what does enrollment need to be for the budget to stay flat? You know, we have a contingency reduction there, a few other savings approaches, but if we wanted to just stop cutting, where does enrollment really need to be to balance all these regular increases that come year over year?
How about, I'm gonna give a primer response to that, and then I'm gonna let Rob jump in. So I don't have the slide number, but the one on enrollment projections that says in-state versus out-of-state, main campus versus RUC, undergrad versus grad. The problem is the mix. So just so you're aware, our numbers this year are 7,531. My hope all along was that it was going to take 3 years to stabilize enrollment, and stabilizing enrollment is kind of that head count perspective, right? So that we have a chance of doing this a year early for this coming fall. So that's kind of what we are working towards, because both, obviously staving off an enrollment decline a year early is a good thing, and also I think it's important politically. So we are doing the best we can to be at that 75-31 again this year. The parts for that are important is that there are right about, and I've got the number written down on my desk, but let's say it's 5,800 of those students are actually in-person students. So one of the things is we don't really ever want to go below that in-person number, and really we're trying to get that target for in-person to be a bottom of 6,000 students. That's unlikely to happen this coming year, but really that's making sure that we've got, I'll say, sufficient collisions between people on campus that it feels like it's an active space, right? So we've got the 75-31 is kind of politically important. And we would like to stay, I think the actual number is 5,786. That is the number of in-person students we got. So roughly 5,800. We're trying to keep both those stable for this coming year. How those budget financials have, but we've cut the budget. Here's the mix of in-state. It's kind of a complicated format. So anyway, I want to give you the framework that I'm working in with leadership right now
of managing that structure really as a graduate students is where we might be able to dollars for tuition might come a grad program, for example. So that could be the case. So if you look at our pricing scenarios, just the head count remaining flat and a 2% increase, that's a $1.9 million surplus to the university. So we'd have $1.5 million just in the semi-growth to growth that we would have to maintain. We know our expenses are going to grow. We have salary increases to give, we have operating, we have mandatory costs. And those, I mentioned the mandatory costs, for example, they track traditionally 5% each year over year. So if we aren't, so the equation is even more complicated because the assumptions are, we have to take into consideration, are you assuming a tuition increase along with an enrollment number? And also state appropriation. Are we anticipating continued appropriations? So the equation is really different, but I think the numbers that President Danilovich gives is exactly right. My preference would be in areas like grad programs, we would at least begin to see some growth because that gives us more cushion and we don't have to rely on only tuition increases to maintain the cost increases.
Okay, well, and it seemed like that was the one thing left out on that slide where we looked at the different scenarios, right? We look at it, what happens if enrollment goes down, so we understand the impact. What we don't talk about is what happens if enrollment goes up. Now, I have significant confidence that our enrollment management team are making great headway. Granted, they're not going to be delivering the growth that we'd like, But just seeing all the activity, even on LinkedIn, and all the videos and all the sessions that are going on within the local school systems, or even at I've seen some in Roanoke. I mean, those are great opportunities. And so it was a missed part of the slide that made me ask that question, right? Well, what if we went the other direction? How much more is the surplus, so that these one-time activities, or the well-being, the first gen center, right? Can those just be funded within the base, simply because we're going to see an enrollment growth? So that's why I asked that question, and I appreciate the response there.
Yeah, George, one other thing I would say, just in generally speaking, 100 students is the equivalent of about $1 million to our bottom line, if that gives you a kind of a perspective. Yeah.
I'm a finance guy. That's a great thing to know.
Okay, great.
And I want to just remind everybody of one item, because it's a little peculiar to higher ed, but all majors are not equal. Speaking to Jeannie for a second, come heck or high water, so to speak, we're going to be increasing our number of students in nursing. Okay, we're going to do that. We just have to. That's like the most expensive program that we run at the institution. So if we go up in enrollment 200 students in nursing, but let's say go down 200 students in humanities, our tuition hasn't changed, but our expenses have gone way up. So, we could say, okay, at this number of students, here's the exact mix we need to break budget even, but it's really difficult to do that. The reality is that we are, planning in general towards a reasonable outcome, but there's a lot of flex between inline, online, graduate, undergraduate, in-state, out-of-state. It's never going to be that number. I think coming up with the number, just what is it to balance, is important, but just recognize it's never going to be there. That's just kind of a North Star to keep us organized around, but the numbers are too dynamic to actually meet that exactly. It just won't happen.
But I think that these questions are getting at the fact that, the strategy that is laid out for, by the administration, needs to accommodate, for instance, the cost of the nursing students and where we're actually focusing our growth efforts. And I think that in the next board meeting, maybe, having that in mind as we talk about enrollment numbers and then that's, activities associated with recruitment. Keeping that in mind. For the strategy.
I think what could be helpful is, again, given these factors like online versus in person, where our efforts are going, so where we anticipate that trending in the mix. It'll be very difficult to put our arms around it, but we can at least say where it's trending. So this is going up, this is going up, this is going down, and that'll help us get a sense on where that push will be on revenue versus expense as the mix changes, because that I think that'll be helpful. That'll be helpful.
And just
question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, George.
I just have one last question on the current board rates that are there, and the discussions that are going on with the vendor. Some of the design here, and of course, being a parent of a student who's has paid a board plan where sometimes they don't use all their money, as they talk about a possible increase, are they accounting, or at least we're ensuring that they're accounting for any unspent money that the students may not have access to? So right now, looking at the slide, right, there's 2 meals a day at $9.25. If a student just doesn't use one of those meals, right, that $9.25 is held hostage and is not used. So as the vendor looks as increases just in the cost of food, how are they taking advantage of the unused dollars to offset that? That would be something to consider. I mean, I know students have been concerned because some folks just don't eat breakfast, and then they don't have access to that first day's meal. So it's like it seems to benefit by design. And speaking as a parent, right, it seems like the vendors are benefiting from unused dollars, but that would be helpful to understand if there's going to be an increase. How does, what is the unused funds that then offset some of the cost increases in food and other related costs?
Yeah, I appreciate that, George. We are having, that is included in the conversations, and we actually made a change this semester somewhat related to that, where we removed, based on student feedback, we removed meal periods, so that someone who misses the breakfast can use that meal later in the day. It doesn't matter when. They could do three meals in the morning or 3 meals at night. We removed those meal periods. That kind of helped. It seemed to really help with that unused amount anyway. But overall, we are also looking at what the carried forward balances could be, what's possible. So that's in negotiations.
And I know this is a bit of a tangent, but this is an instance where working with SGA worked really well. Laura Ellen, who's the SGA president, was getting a lot of feedback that there was challenges in how this was working, and there was a lot of frustration among the students. They brought this through. Susan Tregeser worked with Rob on this as a group. Again, they figured out a better process, and now the feedback from students has been very positive. So it didn't take multiple years. That's a very responsive system, and I appreciate both our SGA for doing that, as well as the administrative team to kind of solve that for our students. That worked out well.
And thank you both for the briefing. I think this was a great briefing, and I really appreciate the answers to my questions. Sorry, I had quite a bit, but this was very helpful for me to prepare for the upcoming board meeting. So thank you.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Okay, Tyler, did you want to have a few wrap-up comments?
Sure. Again, just want to thank everybody for their time and attention participating this morning. I think this has been super helpful for me, just hearing the discussion and some of the questions. I think this engagement really is key and is going to put us on a good path moving forward. Speaking of moving forward, if you have any questions, comments, concerns following the presentation today, please reach out with those so that we can incorporate those into any discussions that are had between now and our March meeting, so that we can prepare and try to flesh out any issues that we may have and get your questions answered. I think, after last year, the biggest priority for each of us was to really change the mix so that we have a process and go into a decision that can be well-based and informed with good data, and can give us a degree of confidence in what we're deciding and how we're moving forward, and making sure that we're putting the institution and our students in the best spot possible. So again, I just really want to thank you for your participation in this briefing, and please reach. I'll be reaching out to each of you individually. That's my goal the rest of this week into next week, to solicit your feedback, but don't hesitate to send those to me now if you have a burning desire to do so. So thank you, Madam Rector, Mr. President, and everybody else. It's good to see you.
Do you have any other closing comments?
No, and I would like to say, you all might not recognize this, but between Tyler and Rob, they put a lot of time in together to getting this organized. So it was a great presentation, but I also like to credit Tyler on this as well, just because it was a lot of work, and I appreciate it.
Well, and I will commend our budget team, who they expedited and have been working to get a lot of the information that we need so we can stay on this timeline. So I'd like to acknowledge the budget team as well.
All right.
Well, I'm so glad that we had this chance, and thank you again to the budget team. Rob, your team has done a great job. Tyler, great leadership in moving this forward, working with Rob and his team. I did want to just very quickly say that, as we heard the presentation, I think that there are some really important and good things that we can take forward with us. In my experience on the board, I have always seen a very conservative approach to budgeting. I think that when you look at us having 2.34% debt burden ratio, and where we can go up to 7% but choose not to, those are some of the metrics that we can look at to ensure that we continue to be as risk averse as possible. And the fact that we continue to right size or make attempts to right size the organization, the operational requirements we need, the fact that you've involved the division heads to make sure that there are reductions where they see fit, and making sure that that's at the operational level, really in a not just at the administrative level. So the other thing I wanted to point out is that us having had an opportunity to move to $15 minimum wage now, I think is really a great benefit for us. So we don't have to worry as a board that, you know, our costs associated with some of the staff are going to go up just from that requirement. And, you know, it comes down to really the importance of stabilizing our enrollment. I think we've seen, you know, how this impacts, and we've learned every single time we talk about the budget, how important that is, and that the organization as a whole is focused on increasing enrollment. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those things because I do think that you all have done a great job putting together this budget. I think the board has done a great job in really reactivating the stringency that we need to be looking at the budgets every year and ongoing throughout the year. What kind of keen eye we need to be having. So kudos to the board and specific members of the board as well on making sure that, you know, we go through this with a stringent approach. And I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge that. So
Great points.
thank you all again. Before we leave, I just want to make sure that you all are aware that on March 12th from 3 to 4:30, we are going to have the budget presentation and public comment opportunity. We'll be here in the boardroom at Martin Hall for that presentation. I just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of that in anticipation of voting on any tuition increase and budget coming in March. So thank you all again for being with us, and we are officially adjourned. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.